Thanks for tuning in online. We are so pleased with all the different people who have been tuning in from all over the country and all over the world to our ministry and what we're doing at All Souls here in Tulsa. If you have a chance to send me an email or connect with me in some way, let me know what you're finding, why you tune in, and what you're getting out of it. I would love to hear from you. I'm always pleased when I get messages from different people who tell me all kinds of things about the impact of All Souls Tulsa's ministry on them and their lives and their families. And if you get a chance to make a gift to support this ministry, to become a partner, we would love to partner with you and have you be a friend of the church and somebody who is actually supporting us to create this congregation and the world that we're trying to create together. You can be a part of it, and every gift of every amount makes a difference. We really appreciate your support.
Hello again. You're an energetic bunch, aren't you? I like that. I'll share something with you. In this past May, I turned 50 years old. Thank you. And I didn't really experience a midlife crisis, but something did become extremely important to me and somewhat clear, and that is this, that life has a poetic quality to it. There's a poetic quality to life, and there's something about popular culture, for example. For me, hip-hop, but I'll spare you that. But for me, hip-hop has pointed this out. But again, cultural production in more general terms points to the fact that life has a poetic quality. Some years ago, I stumbled across a singer who has meant the world to me, Nina Simone. Maybe you know her, yeah? And one piece in particular, a friend sent it to me on my birthday, and I've been listening to it regularly ever since. There's rarely a day that passes by when I don't listen to this song at least once. And some of the words I'll share with you. It's a new dawn. It's a new day. It's a new life for me. And I'm feeling good. And my commitment to myself at 50 was to try to live into the truth of that claim. It also became increasingly evident to me that stories matter. Narratives matter. That our stories, our narratives give life a certain tone and texture, a certain oomph that is just breathtaking. It allows us to do what my grandmother sent me off to college to do. She sat me down in Buffalo, New York, and said to me this, and I didn't quite understand it at the time. I just thought that was Granny Hargrave, and I'd be respectful and smile and nod because I didn't want the slap. But she said to me, move through the world knowing your footsteps matter. Move through the world knowing your footsteps matter. I grew up in Buffalo, New York. My family moved to Buffalo, New York as part of the Great Migration, that massive movement of African Americans into northern and southern cities as the Civil War is winding down, right? They're looking for opportunities, and my families, the Hargraves and the Pinns, left North Carolina and Virginia heading to Buffalo because there were opportunities. Bethlehem Steel, right outside of Buffalo, meant a different life, a different vantage point, an opportunity for my family to catch its economic breath and to do something different. My mother's parents were college educated, but in North Carolina that mattered little. Opportunities were restricted. But in Buffalo, they saw an opportunity to give their children what those children could not have in North Carolina or a little town in Virginia. I'm the youngest within my immediate family. I have a brother, Raymond, who passed away a few years ago, a sister, Joyce, who's still in Buffalo, a brother that I never met. He died before I was born, Kenny, and then my sister, Linda. There's 9 years between me and Linda, 14 years between me and Joyce, and 15 between me and Raymond. I always understood it this way, that I was unexpected. My mother says I was a pleasant surprise and a gift. So that is our takeaway. Tony Pinn was a pleasant surprise and a gift. I can remember as a small child going to church with my grandfather. He was a Baptist deacon. And it was enjoyable going to church with my grandfather, in part because I got to see my grandfather with authority and power. People listened to what my grandfather had to say. He wasn't an ordained minister, but it didn't matter. He sat in a special section of the church, and people wanted his opinion, and that was kind of cool. It was also an opportunity to meet some of my friends, and we had a particular game we would play. Every person had a hymnal, and we would quickly open up the hymnal. And the key was to try to land on the same hymn. And if we did that, game was over, and the next phase was to go to the restroom and try to stay away from the sanctuary for as long as possible without getting in trouble. It's more difficult than you might think. But I enjoyed this. It was just part of Sunday. It was Sunday culture. And after church, we would go to my grandmother and grandfather's house, the Hargraves, and we'd have Sunday dinner. Stewed tomatoes, always stewed tomatoes. String beans, macaroni and cheese, chicken. It was just a time to gather, and it was wonderful. But it reached a point where my mother decided that was no longer the place for us, that she didn't want me and she didn't want my siblings in this environment in which women could not be all they could be because of gender discrimination, right? For her, this was a problem. To be in a church where women could not be in leadership positions simply because they were women. This is not a lesson she wanted us learning long term. So we moved to a church closer to our home. It was an independent church, no denominational affiliation at that point. And one Sunday, my mother and my sister Linda joined. Next Sunday, I went with them, and I played my hymnal game. I'll call them back later. We played our hymnal game, and I took my nap. I often took a little nap. The hymnal game could be rather tiring, so I took a little nap, and I woke up and I asked my mother, what were those people doing who were walking to the front of the church? And she said, they're giving their lives to Christ and joining the church. And I thought, well, okay, if they get to do that, then I'm going to do it. You know, my turn. And my mother was tickled. I mean, she was pleased. You know, the Lord is on this young man. So I walked to the front of the church, and I shook the person's hand, the church secretary, and said, my name is Anthony Bernard Pinn, and I'm going to join. We spent a lot of time at that church, not just Sundays and Saturdays, but during the course of the week. This was a vital community for us. It was it had meaning for us, and we spent time there. It was a small church, so the minister not only preached, but he was responsible for my Sunday school class. And one Sunday, we're in his office before service. We're sitting in a circle. I'll never forget it, sitting in this circle. And he went around and he asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? Often he would pose these sorts of questions because the Sunday school materials we had access to were not written for us. Jimmy and Jane didn't have our kinds of issues. Right? So every now and then we needed a break from those materials. Yeah? We needed a break from those materials. And Reverend Hudson asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? And folks gave typical responses. I'm going to be a lawyer, doctor, president. And he got to me and I said, I'm going to be a minister. I don't know why I said it. It's nothing I'd given a lot of attention to, and there were no prominent ministers in my immediate family. My father didn't go to church. He thought it was a waste of time. There were no prominent ministers in my family, but I said, I'm going to be a minister. And I'm not quite certain what I expected him to say, but this is what he told me. We start next Sunday. So in a short period of time, I was lining hymns, yeah. I was blessing offerings. I was giving prayers. I was opening the doors of the church and inviting people to become disciples of Christ. Life shifted for me. I couldn't go to the corner store alone. I had to be inside my house before the street lights came on, but I was now a spiritual leader, in part because within my African Methodist Episcopal Church, it had become this now, there was only one criterion for ministry: calling. Calling. And there was only one form of proof with respect to calling. What do you achieve? Right? You say you're called. What kind of fruit does this bear? And you give people the benefit of the doubt, give them an opportunity for their ministries to bear fruit. And you've got to train people. And so I started this process, and I thought, wow, I can't go to the store alone. But these people listen to what I have to say. And I kind of grew into this role. Now, this church went through a series of ministers, and it became clear that there was great potential. This was in a rather robust Black community in Buffalo, New York. There was great potential for growth, but they needed a minister who had that ability. And they brought this young guy from Philadelphia who was known as a church builder, Reverend Fred Lucas. Young guy, young cat, but he was understood as someone who grew churches. He came and they told him, Tony has a call on his life. The Lord has anointed him. And after a little while, Fred Lucas said, okay, let's check into this. I gave my trial sermon when I was a preteen. I gave my first sermon, and that went well, and I had to go before the elders of the church and answer questions concerning my calling. That went well. I had to go before the presiding elder who was responsible for that region of the country and answer questions concerning calling, and that went well. And there's a series of tests that one goes through, and I passed those, and I was on my way. I was involved in church ministry. I was one of the youth pastors at this church in Buffalo, and things were going well. This was my world. It seemed to make sense. Now, within my family, it was understood education was nothing you play with. Of course you get an education. That's a no-brainer. The question becomes, where do you go to school? And my grandmother told me, look, let's be clear on this, Tony. I would not make use of an attorney who did not have a JD, nor would I secure the services of a doctor without an MD. And my son would not be a minister without proper training. Yeah. Her son would not be a minister without proper training, not her grandson. Her son would not be a minister without proper training. So that was a given. I was going to school. The question was where. And I had to get out of Buffalo, New York. I had friends and family there, but there wasn't sufficient ambition. And I just knew if I stayed in Buffalo, any level of ambition would just slowly drain away, that folks were content to just go along to get along. But I had a sense that there was a calling on my life, that there was greatness in store for me, and this required getting out of Buffalo. I loved New York City. New York City was my place, and it remains the place I consider home. And it turns out that Fred Lucas was being reassigned to a much larger church in Brooklyn, New York. So I took this as a sign. Fred Lucas is going to Brooklyn, I'm going to New York. I applied to a variety of schools and decided I was going to Columbia. I was going to be in New York, and this was wonderful. I was going to set that campus on fire for God. This was my plan. I was going to transform that place, set it on fire for the Lord. I got there, and it was a world unfamiliar to me. I'd left a school in Buffalo that was committed to gifted students and had gone to a rather small Southern Baptist high school because I felt I needed to be with those who had a similar vision of the world. So I went to this small Southern Baptist school that was a feeder school for Bob Jones University. But I thought, I need to be with folks who value God and understand education, but understand that education has to be filtered through the truth of the gospel. I went there, and part of that process involved losing my abilities for critical thought, because that was not rewarded. So I get to Columbia, and these people don't believe what I believe. I'm taking courses, and they're talking about the Bible, get this, as if it's just a piece of literature. And they did this in a way that was unapologetic. I'm encountering people who are participating in a variety of traditions, and they do this without any fear of hellfire, and it's just blowing my mind. Right? I'm working as a youth pastor in this church in Brooklyn, in Bedford-Stuyvesant. It was a rough, economically challenged area of the country in the 80s. It was rough. Not Bedford-Stuyvesant 2015, Bedford-Stuyvesant 1982. Different world. I'm working as a youth minister in this church of 3,500, and I'm trying to make sense of all of this, and I'm on the Columbia campus with folks who don't appreciate my religious sensibilities. This was hard for me, really, and this was the huge challenge here. This was the huge challenge. I encountered people who, from my perspective, were in danger of hellfire, but they often treated me better and with more compassion than the folks at my church. And what's an 18-year-old to do with this? Right? It runs contrary to everything I had been trained to believe. It just blew my mind, and I'm wrestling trying to hold all of this together. And I do this with some success until roughly my junior year, and it becomes too much for me. I'm reworking my understanding of God. I'm reworking my understanding of Christian ethics in light of what I'm encountering in classrooms and what I'm encountering just walking around Harlem. I'm making these adjustments, but my junior year, it's so much that there were some Sundays I just could not handle it. I had to be in Brooklyn for the 6 o'clock a.m. service on Sundays. That wasn't really an issue. Man, I could get there on time. But there were some Sundays I just couldn't do it. I couldn't be in the pulpit. I had questions, I didn't have answers, and that wasn't supposed to be the nature of ministry. I was supposed to have answers. All I had were questions, things I was no longer clear about. And so some Sundays I'd make my way across the campus early enough to get there on time, go to the 116th Street train station and let the number one pass by, and I'd let another pass by, and I'd look at the time and perhaps let another pass by. And then I'd make my way finally to 59th Street to get that famous A train to Brooklyn. And I'd sit and let a train go by, and I'd let another go by, and I'd watch the time and perhaps get that third. I'd get off in Brooklyn, Boys and Girls High School, a rather tragic high school, and I'd slowly walk to the church. The goal was this, to get there so late that I would not have to participate in the order of service. I wouldn't have to be in the pulpit. And I could tell Reverend Lucas, Doc, it was the train. Right, but it gave me an opportunity to catch my breath. I was still committed to ministry, but I wasn't quite certain how to pull this together, that my faith had finally encountered the world. And I was having difficulties. I was interested in ministry, but I wasn't quite certain the look of that ministry. I knew I had to go to seminary, but I knew I had to get out of New York. Everyone assumed I would go to Union Theological Seminary to work with the great Dr. James Cone, the father of Black Theology, this vibrant form of liberation theology. But I had to leave New York because I couldn't think the questions I needed to think, because this church, Bridge Street Church, demanded I have answers, and all I had were questions. I had to leave. I'm still interested in ministry, and I wanted to go to a place where intellectual questions mattered more than ministry. Because I needed to probe, and I needed to wrestle, and I needed some breathing room to do that. And I decided on Harvard Divinity School. So I get there, and I have some space. Right? It's not that far from New York, but it was sufficient space. I could catch my breath and start thinking. And I worked at a church in Roxbury. And this church was across the street from a park. And it was an inner city park, so no soft nets on these basketball hoops, just chains. So you'd hear the shh of the chain. And folks who didn't play basketball might be in this park dealing crack, because crack was big, yeah? Prostitution in this park, and it's across the street from the church. And I'd ask the pastor about the situation there, because I'm the youth minister, and we're losing young people, literally losing young people. They're dying. They're dying. Whether they're active in gang violence or not, they were subject to it. And my young people were literally dying, and I didn't have anything to say that seemed to make a difference. And I asked the pastor, what do we do? And he said, let the people get happy with you. I wasn't happy. Right? I didn't think a hoop and a shout would solve this one. I'm still trying to be a Christian, but my notion of God is changing rapidly. It's changing rapidly. I left Buffalo with a sense of a God who is on the throne and all is well, and God breaks into human history and makes stuff happen. When I got to Roxbury, I had a God who operated based upon persuasion. What my grandmother and my mother called that still, small voice, urging us to do the good. But it was reaching a point where even that wasn't satisfying. I had nothing to give people, and it seemed rather empty to me. And I moved from the Master of Divinity program into the PhD program, and I'm wrestling with these sorts of issues. How to make sense of this? What kind of ministry could I possibly have? And certain people appealed to me, like Adam Clayton Powell Jr., for whom ministry was all about the good work, making human history different, transforming the felt nature of life. This made a bit more sense to me, but I'm still wrestling with this, trying to make some sense of this, trying to hold on to this faith. I'm having a really hard time with this, but very few people with whom I can share this. But I'm working at it. I'm trying. But it reached a point where I had to make a decision. I could work to maintain this tradition, this Christian faith, and transform it as best I could and keep it somewhat relevant and spend all of my time and energy trying to do that. Or I could really be about the people. I just didn't see a way to do both. I had to make a decision. And I decided that I would not be a hypocrite. There were lots of things I was willing to be, but I was not going to be a hypocrite. I could no longer be in the pulpit preaching what I didn't think was accurate, that I owed people more than that. Right out of respect, I owed them more than that. So I contacted the pastor of this church and said I would no longer be participating, that I was just done. I contacted my bishop and indicated that I was surrendering ordination, that I was no longer a part of that process. I was no longer a minister. And for me, this wasn't just a rejection of the African Methodist Episcopal Church as if all of the problems were just lodged within this one denomination. I had a question, and theism didn't seem to answer it. So I had to speak a new word, that God is not helping us with this because there is no God, just us, struggling in a way that is awkward and often bulky, but trying to do the best we can, trying to make a difference in the world. So I left it all behind, but I wasn't quite certain what to call myself at that point. I knew what I wasn't. I was no longer a theist. I wasn't a Christian any longer. But what was I? I wasn't quite certain. And it didn't really matter to me how people would respond to this change. I had to have integrity. And if people couldn't get with it, that was fine. I had no fear of losing family and friends. I had to be true. I was not going to be a hypocrite. I didn't believe any longer, and folks needed to know it. So I told my family, and lots of members of my family just said, well, this is Tony, whatever. Right, whatever. And my mother said, you know, I disagree. I hope you'll come back, but you're my son, you're my blood, and I love you. I lost some friends, whatever, gained some new ones, but wasn't quite certain what to call myself. I graduated from Harvard and took my first job at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, and Minnesotans were nice to me until the Star Tribune did a profile piece on me. It was a Saturday, so it's a slow news day, and I'm thinking nobody's going to read this, right? And nobody's going to care about this. But that Sunday, there was all sorts of nastiness, and I got to my office on Monday, and there were nasty phone calls for me, right? Just nastiness. I got hate mail. I mean, just horrible stuff. People questioning my fit at Macalester. Yeah, you know what that means. Questioning my fit. And I'm going through my second year review at this point. So the question is, do I get to keep my job? Going through all of this and all of this nastiness, but then some very kind and thoughtful phone calls from local UU saying, hey, I can't fully understand nor fully appreciate what this means for you, but we're here. So if you want to chat about it, if you want to talk about it, just let us know. We're here. We're here. And it took me some time before I could embrace the UUA. I am a member. It took me some time before I could embrace it, and I'll just pause and you can think of what those reasons might be. But eventually I did. And so for me, living life fully involves this, an effort to move through the world in a way that respects what my grandmother said. Move through the world knowing your footsteps matter. Be intentional about life. Yeah, this is all I have. And it's required a different orientation, that I no longer think in terms of guaranteed outcomes. I think in terms of struggle, effort, and that there's something wonderful. There's a type of beauty in our struggle to make a difference. One of my favorite philosophers is Albert Camus. And Albert Camus, in talking about Sisyphus, right, the dude who's rolling that stone up the hill and it comes back down and he's rolling it back up, for Albert Camus, this says something about the human struggle to make difference, yeah? And he's saying this in the context of the atrocities of World War, that you just push, you just keep making an effort, you do what you can, knowing that the stone will come back, but there's something wonderful in struggle. And he ends that short section on the myth of Sisyphus with these words. We have to imagine Sisyphus happy. It's a different life orientation, but again, the poetic quality of life gives us a way of thinking about this, and for me, there's no one better at this than Nina Simone. Woo! You didn't tell me that was going to happen. Wow. I leave you with her words once again. It's a new dawn. It's a new day. It's a new life for me. And what? I'm feeling good. Thank you so much.